Bahia, Brazil, 1798. In the silent dawn of Salvador's square, a man with dark, calloused hands pressed a piece of charcoal to the wall. The word he wrote was small: Liberdade, freedom. By sunrise, the empire trembled. His name was Domingos da Liberdade, and with one word, he declared war on chains. At the end of the 18th century, Bahia was the beating heart of the Portuguese Empire in the Americas and its most painful wound. From the harbor of Salvador, the scent of sugar drifted across the sea, sweet and deceptive. Behind that sweetness lay the stench of blood, sweat, and despair. Ships arrived daily from Angola, Benin, and Congo, carrying men, women, and children shackled in darkness, traded like barrels of rum. The markets echoed not with laughter, but with chains striking stone. In the plantations of the Reconcavo, cane fields stretched to the horizon like endless scars across the land. Overseers shouted orders. The crack of the whip punctured the humid air. At night, the sound of drums rose from the quarters of the enslaved rhythms carried from Africa, whispering prayers for freedom no overseer could silence. Bahia was a crossroads where two worlds collided: the brutality of empire and the resilience of those who refused to vanish. But beneath the cruelty, something new was fermenting. The people of color, enslaved, freed, or born between, began to speak words forbidden by the crown. They spoke of equality, of a world where race did not determine a man's worth, and though the empire dismissed it as madness, the idea had already found a host. In the alleys of Salvador, in the markets, in the secret corners of taverns, the word Liberdade began to echo faintly at first, then louder, until even the air seemed to vibrate with it. It was in this world that a man named Domingos emerged, a craftsman with hands blackened by work and a voice sharpened by injustice. He was not a soldier or a noble. He was the child of a continent that had been broken, yet he stood upright. In Bahia, where sugar and blood had become one, Domingos carried within him a seed, the dangerous seed of freedom. No one truly knew where Domingos da Liberdade was born. Some said he first opened his eyes inside the belly of a slave ship. Others whispered he had once been free before being taken. But all agreed on one thing: his name was not a coincidence. Domingos da Liberdade, Domingos of freedom. It was both a name and a prophecy. He lived in Salvador as an artisan, working with iron and wood, his hands creating what the empire could not destroy: tools, doors, instruments of life. Unlike many of his peers, he could read and write, a rare gift that made him both respected and feared. In the evenings, when the city settled under its humid silence, he gathered with others, tailors, freedmen, black soldiers, to read aloud the news from faraway lands. They read about a world turned upside down: France, where kings had fallen and men now spoke of liberté, égalité, fraternité, freedom, equality, brotherhood. Those words struck the hearts of men who had known only chains. Domingos's voice, calm but burning, carried through the dim candlelight as he read, "All men are born free." Each word was a spark, and in Bahia, sparks were dangerous. Domingos began to dream of a Brazil that belonged not to the crown, but to its people, black, white, and mixed alike. He did not dream for himself. He dreamed for all. Those who listened to him said his eyes held the stillness of someone who had already made peace with death. Perhaps he knew that in an empire built on slavery, the greatest crime was to imagine freedom. By 1798, the tension in Bahia had become a pulse, steady and defiant. Across the narrow alleys of Salvador, whispers spread faster than sugar ships could sail. A group of black and mixed-race artisans, soldiers and freedmen, began meeting in secret. They called themselves os alfaiates, the tailors. Their tools by day mended torn clothes. By night, they stitched together a vision of a nation reborn. Domingos da Liberdade was among them, his voice calm but unwavering. Around a flickering oil lamp, they spoke of a republic, one without masters, without slavery, without the crushing taxes that kept the poor chained as surely as iron. They dreamed of equality not as an idea, but as a reality. The tailors began to write. With scraps of paper and ink smuggled from workshops, they composed messages to the people of Bahia. Some were short and fierce, others poetic and defiant. Black, white, and mixed, all are children of the same God. Freedom for all, death to tyranny. Long live the Bahian Republic. Domingos's handwriting was steady, almost tender, as if each word were a wound being dressed. But to the Portuguese crown, those words were poison. The colonial governors had built their power on silence. Domingos and his companions had chosen to speak. Soon, the group decided to act. The plan was simple but audacious, to spread their message through the city in one night, before dawn could erase their courage. They would write the word Liberdade, where everyone could see it on walls, doors, and market stalls. A revolution born not from swords, but from sentences. In Bahia, where a whisper could mean death, they were about to let the whole city hear them. It was August, 1798. The air in Salvador hung thick with salt and tension. Under a moon half hidden by clouds, Domingos and a handful of men moved through the sleeping streets, carrying charcoal and folded papers. The cobblestones beneath them still glistened from the rain, reflecting the faint glow of their lanterns. They began at the Praça da Piedade, the Square of Mercy, though that night it knew none. On the walls, they wrote with shaking hands, Liberdade para todos, freedom for all. The letters were rough, uneven, but alive. They breathed rebellion. One man climbed a pillar and pinned a leaflet fluttering like a wounded bird in the night breeze. Another whispered a prayer as he pasted a message onto the door of a church. All men are equal before God. By dawn, the city had become a book written by the oppressed. Market vendors found their stalls covered in ink and hope. Soldiers woke to find their barracks marked by the same word, Liberdade. The people read in silence at first. Then someone spoke it aloud. The word spread like fire across tongues that had been silent too long. But while the city stirred with wonder, others stirred with fear. From the shadows, colonial soldiers followed the faint trail of ashes and footprints. The crown would not forgive such defiance. As the sun rose over Salvador, it cast light upon the walls, blackened with charcoal, and upon the faces of those who dared to dream. For a few hours, the city belonged to the people. And in that fragile dawn, freedom was real. Before the ink on the walls had fully dried, the empire moved. By sunrise, the governor's guards were combing through the streets of Salvador, scraping off the word Liberdade as if it were a disease. But freedom, once spoken, does not wash away. The whispers had already escaped the walls. At dawn, soldiers broke into homes without knocking. Boots thudded against doors, and torches filled alleys with firelight. They dragged men from their beds, artisans, soldiers, tailors, anyone who could read or dared to dream, and at the center of it all, they found Domingos da Liberdade. He did not resist. He simply asked if they had read what he wrote. The guards struck him, bound his wrists with rope, and hauled him into the streets. Children watched from doorways as the man who had written freedom for all was led away in chains. Inside the damp cells of the fortress prison, interrogation began. The empire wanted names, plans, confessions. They wanted to know who had dared imagine equality. Domingos said little. His voice was low, but his silence screamed louder than any words. The torturers brought out the tools, iron rods, water mixed with salt. They tied him down and poured it over the wounds on his back. Yet when they demanded he name his comrades, he answered only, "I do not speak for God, I speak for man." Days turned into weeks. Some of the captured broke under pain, others vanished into dungeons. But even as the crown crushed the rebellion, it feared what could not be tortured, an idea that had already taken root. For the first time, Brazil's empire realized that its chains were not eternal. Domingos remained behind bars, bleeding, waiting for the inevitable trial. Outside, the city that had once echoed with Liberdade had fallen silent again, but silence, now, was not obedience. It was mourning. They built the gallows before the verdict. In the main square of Salvador, under a burning sun, the colonial authorities arranged a public trial not to seek truth, but to teach fear. The accused were marched out in chains: Domingos da Liberdade, João de Deus, Lucas Dantas, and Manuel Faustino, 4 men who had dared to dream as equals. The courtroom was surrounded by soldiers, the air heavy with incense and sweat. The judge read out the charges in a voice thick with hatred: treason against the crown, sedition, inciting revolt among the enslaved. Each word was meant to erase their humanity. Domingos stood barefoot, his body thin, his face calm. When asked if he denied the crime, he raised his head and said, "If to wish freedom is treason, then I am guilty." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some looked away, others wept quietly. The judge ordered silence. The verdict was already written. They were sentenced to death by hanging. their heads to be severed and displayed in the city's squares as a warning. Yet in that moment, it was the crown that looked afraid. The four men did not beg, did not cry, did not plead for mercy. The people began to whisper their names, the men of freedom. Women brought flowers to the steps of the court that night, placing them where the condemned had stood. Domingos smiled when he heard. For him, the trial had already failed. The empire could take his body, but it could not reclaim the word he had given the world. In the silence that followed, Bahia waited not for justice, but for a reckoning. Morning came, dressed in sorrow. The bells of Salvador tolled not for the crown, but for four men about to die for a dream. The square filled with soldiers, clergy, merchants, and the poor, everyone drawn by something greater than curiosity. They came to witness the execution of Domingos da Liberdade, João de Deus, Lucas Dantas, and Manuel Faustino, the tailors who had sown rebellion from scraps of hope. The gallows stood in the center of the Praça da Piedade, tall and clean as if polished for ceremony. The sun burned the ropes into gold, and the crowd held its breath. Domingos walked barefoot, his steps steady, his eyes fixed not on the scaffold but on the horizon, as though freedom waited there. When the priest offered him final words, he refused confession. "I have nothing to repent," he said softly. His voice was calm, the kind of calm that frightens kings. Then he turned to the people, not to the officials, not to the soldiers, but to those who had once read his charcoal words on the wall. He raised his voice. "Liberdade, mesmo que o corpo mora." Freedom, even if the body dies. The cry cut through the square like thunder. Women screamed, men covered their faces. Even the executioner's hands trembled. Moments later, the trapdoor opened, and four bodies swung in the wind. The crowd did not cheer. Some knelt, others wept. The silence that followed was not fear, it was reverence. From that day forward, the people began calling the square by a new name, Praça da Liberdade, the Square of Freedom. Domingos' body was left hanging as an example, but by dusk, it had become something else, a banner. The empire could only see a corpse, the people saw a martyr. The word liberdade was no longer a crime, it had become sacred. That night, the officials of the Portuguese crown gathered to celebrate their victory. Wine was poured, and the governor signed orders to erase all trace of the rebellion. The documents declared the movement destroyed, its leaders executed, its writings burned. In the record books of Lisbon, the story ended there. But history does not obey paperwork. In Bahia, people carried the memory like a forbidden melody. The soldiers tore down the leaflets, yet could not stop the songs rising from the quarters of the enslaved. Mothers whispered Domingos's words to their children as lullabies. Drummers carved his name into rhythms, played on hollow logs, so that even when no one dared to speak, the sound of Liberdade still filled the night. The authorities ordered the gallows dismantled, but no matter how they scraped the wood, they could not remove the shadow of the rope from the square. Those who had witnessed the hanging said they could still hear his final shout whenever the wind blew through Salvador's streets. The crown believed it had silenced the rebellion, yet every lash on a back, every tax, every injustice reopened the wound that Domingos had named. Freedom had become a ghost invisible, but everywhere. A year later, rumors of revolt flickered again, and though no one dared to write the word on the walls anymore, its echo lived in hearts that no soldier could arrest. Domingos da Liberdade was gone, but his idea had slipped through the bars, untouchable. The empire ruled Brazil with laws and swords, but Bahia belonged to memory. Time passed, as it always does, silently, relentlessly. Decades turned into centuries, and yet the soil of Bahia never forgot the blood spilled upon it. Every generation was born beneath the shadow of that gallows. Every child learned to whisper the word Liberdade before they could even write their own name. In 1822, Brazil declared independence from Portugal. Fireworks lit the sky, flags waved, and kings were replaced by emperors. But among the people of Bahia, there was a quiet knowing freedom on paper is not freedom in flesh. The plantations still bled, the whips still cracked. For the poor and the dark-skinned, nothing had changed. Yet the seed Domingos had planted continued to grow in secret. Tailors told their apprentices stories of the men who died with dignity. Soldiers remembered the four who had walked to the gallows without lowering their eyes. Priests whispered their names in prayer, defying the silence the crown had once demanded. Nearly a century later, in 1888, When Brazil finally abolished slavery, many in Bahia wept. Some celebrated, others simply knelt in silence. They said the word that had cost Domingos his life had finally become law. But even then, true equality remained distant. Liberty was now legal, but justice still cost too much. Still, in Salvador, every November, people gathered in the square once known as Praça da Piedade. They lit candles, sang songs in Yoruba and Portuguese, and remembered the 4 who had died there. They did not need statues. They had memory. They did not need monuments. They had music. For them, Domingos da Liberdade was not a ghost, but a voice, one that rose each time a drumbeat echoed through Bahia's humid nights. And when young activists of later centuries painted the word Liberdade on city walls, they were not committing rebellion. They were finishing a sentence he began. Domingos da Liberdade was not a general. He commanded no army, owned no land, and carried no title. His only weapon was a piece of charcoal, his only battlefield a wall, and yet that was enough to shake an empire. He did not fight for vengeance or for glory. He fought for something invisible, a truth so simple that kings feared it, that no man was born to kneel. 200 years later, the city he once walked still breathes his words. Tourists pass through Praça da Liberdade, unaware of the pain beneath their footsteps, but the locals know. They still speak his name softly, like a prayer and a warning. Freedom, Domingos taught, is not a favor granted by rulers. It is a birthright, whispered in the heart of every person who suffers. It cannot be bought, and it cannot be buried. He died with a rope around his neck, but in that final breath, he freed a nation's conscience. Today, every act of defiance, every voice that rises against oppression, carries a spark of his charcoal flame. When people write Liberdade on the walls of Bahia, they do not simply decorate them, they resurrect him. Domingos da Liberdade lives wherever someone dares to say, I am human. I deserve to be free. And that is the one truth no empire has ever been able to kill.